Most women think that labor starts with the first contraction, but the truth is that labor begins weeks before that. Your body starts to release hormones, the baby, the placenta release hormones, your oxytocin receptors change. And the best part is that there are natural ways to help support your body through this process. In today's episode, we will be talking to Sarah Thompson of Functional Maternity about ways that your cervix changes and ripens to get you ready for birth, oxytocin receptors, which is connected to contractions, how stress impacts labor, as well as nutritional strategies to help support and prepare your body for labor and birth. If you want to feel more prepared for labor and birth and confident as you go into that process, stay tuned. This is an episode that every pregnant woman must hear. Hello and welcome to the Life Optimizer podcast. My name is Victoria. I'm a Yale-trained certified nurse midwife and science nerd looking to make relationships and health simple. Today, my guest is Sarah Thompson of Functional Maternity. She wrote an amazing book that I highly recommend, and she is a functional medicine practitioner, acupuncturist, author, and she takes care of women and helps them have a healthy pregnancy. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Victoria.
Absolutely. And today I really want to dive into labor and how our body prepares for labor. And most women think that labor starts at the first contraction. Can you tell us really when labor actually begins or when our body begins to get ready for labor and birth?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those misconceptions. When we think about labor and delivery, we think labor and delivery. But the maternal physiology is actually making changes in preparation for labor as early as the end of the second trimester. So there's a lot of kind of microscopic little changes that are happening, and they start off slow, right? It's not just like we're pregnant and labor. It's this slow progression, and then we hit 28 weeks and all these hormones just kind of skyrocket. And as our babies mature, they're sending little bits of more of these signals, and all of these signals are making changes kind of as we go. And the biggest thing we see changing that early on in gestation is actually the cervix. The cervix starts to remodel itself pretty early in conception. This is why we see things like cervical insufficiency, preterm labor associated with cervical changes that happen too fast.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the cervix. What role do mom, baby, placenta play on these cervical changes?
Oh, so
Or on
many
changes
things.
in general, on physiology in general, and then
Yeah.
the beginning of labor?
I know I have this horrible drawing, and as I talk about labor and delivery, I like draw it out on paper so it keeps me on track. But when we're looking at labor and delivery, baby, placenta, all those things, most of these changes that we're seeing in the maternal physiology is actually driven by the baby itself. The baby's adrenal glands are 90% bigger midway through gestation than they will be after delivery. And these fetal adrenal glands are producing, well, wouldn't you know it, adrenal hormones. And the two biggest adrenal hormones we talk about are cortisol and DHEA. Now let's talk about cortisol first. So cortisol is going to go and kind of irritate the placenta, and the placenta is going to produce hormones like corticotropin releasing hormone that then tell the mom to produce more, well, cortisol, right? Now that cortisol is going to go back to baby to help stimulate lung development, gut development, all of this maturation that has to happen in the third trimester. And we'll start to see these fetal cortisol levels start to increase as early as 18 weeks. Now, again, we don't expect the cervix to make changes. We don't expect these excessively high levels of cortisol that we will see, say, towards the end of pregnancy, which we can see by the time we're at term, a 500% increase in cortisol production in pregnancy. And that cortisol is primarily, again, coming from the baby's adrenal glands and then stimulating mom's adrenal glands to produce, well, more cortisol. Now, that cortisol also plays with the cervix. At the beginning of conception, now let's talk about the structure of the cervix real quick. The cervix itself is just a big old ball of collagen fibers, really, right? And one of the things that happens early on in pregnancy is, well, we get this huge surge in progesterone, and progesterone tells these fibers to kind of wind themselves together, right? It creates almost a bird's nest binding of these cervical fibers. So that cervix is like high and tight, right? We don't want that baby coming out. We want those fibers nice and tight. As cortisol levels increase, what we see is that cortisol changes the type of progesterone receptor that is present in the cervical tissues. So when we're looking at progesterone, we have two different progesterone receptors. We have progesterone receptor B and we have progesterone receptor A. Now, progesterone receptor B is the functional progesterone receptor, where the progesterone receptor A is considered a non-functional progesterone receptor. And what we see cortisol do is it slowly starts to change the type of progesterone receptor that is present in the cervix. Therefore, even though our progesterone levels do one of these at 28 weeks and skyrockets, the number of receptors in which it can bind to on the cervix starts to go down the higher cortisol levels go up. How cool is that, right? And so what we find is what cortisol does over the course of months, right? Not weeks, not days, but months, is it starts to unwind these fibers, right? And we start to see, and this is all stuff that you're not going to be able to, visualize looking at the cervix or even get a good grasp on if you're doing a cervical check. These are all microscopic changes that are happening so that eventually these fibers are a little bit more in their parallel structure versus that wound up structure. And that's what cortisol is doing. So as we're remodeling this cervix, we have to remake different types of collagen. And collagen formation, collagen structure, there's a lot that goes into that as well. We find that vitamin C becomes a really important thing for that cervical structure, making sure it's not remodeling too fast, right? We want balance here. Again, I always talk about everything in maternity care is Goldilocksing, right? Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And that's kind of the idea of functional medicine in general is how do we balance things? How do we keep things from maybe going too inflammatory, but also we don't want to go too anti-inflammatory because we need inflammation for things like cervical ripening to happen. This is a very inflammatory process that we're talking about. We just need it controlled. So vitamin C does play a big role in this. Actually, it helps to maintain that structure. We know that vitamin C plays into collagen structure and function. The other thing we see being very important here is glycine. Now, glycine is an amino acid, and outside of pregnancy, it's considered a non-essential amino acid. In pregnancy, we consider it a conditionally essential amino acid, meaning you can't make enough of it from other amino acids. You have to get it in the diet. And glycine is found in the highest amounts in things like slow cooked meats that have a lot of, wouldn't you know it, collagen and cartilage in it. So if we're doing like dietary stuff, sometimes I'll have clients do a lot of pot roasts, right? Pot roast is a really good way to do this. Roasted bone-in, skin-on chicken. These are all good ways to get some of that extra glycine, to get some of that connective tissue amino acid complex. So that's the very first thing that's actually happening in the body as we prepare for labor and delivery, is this cortisol surge. It's the very first thing we're going to see.
From the baby and then eventually from the mom. I can see people thinking about why should we even care about the cervix and what is it about the cervix that matters and why are we talking about cervical remodeling happening starting at even 18 weeks? Can you tell us a little bit about the cervix and why it matters, not just the uterus, but all parts of it?
Absolutely. The cervix is, in my opinion, one of the most important parts of labor and delivery because say oxytocin kicks in, we get these beautiful contractions. You have to go through the cervical remodeling process before those contractions can even push a baby through the cervix. If those fibers are still tight, or maybe we have some unwound, but some that are still firm, we have to wait for these guys to unwind themselves and then the next series of steps to happen before those contractions can be effective. It used to be that with inductions, for example. The primary induction method was Pitocin based. Thanks to a couple of studies that started learning about the cervix a little bit more, we started to say, oh, shoot, we have to unlock the door before we open it. And unlocking that door is the cervical remodeling component. This is why they now use cervical ripening agents in induction protocols before they give you Pitocin. You have to have a favorable cervix, meaning you've done this work in the maternal physiology to allow Pitocin or oxytocin to do its job. Oxytocin is the last guy to come on the scene. All of this work leading up to that moment is probably the most important thing that needs to happen for a functional childbirth experience. And it happens, again, we talk about this, when I'm working with clients or if I'm talking to providers, we start really looking hard at how the body is functioning from that perspective, or at least supporting the natural physiology at like 28 weeks, right? That's when we see these hormones because they've been kind of just increasing. And man, 28 weeks hits and those hormones just skyrocket. And I'll even talk to women who say, man, I was feeling myself. And then 28 weeks hit and it was like a switch went off. And all of a sudden my body started to feel different every single day after that. And I said, yes, because you are different. You're changing. You're changing on the inside. You just don't see it.
Absolutely. And I find that that cervical remodeling is so important in terms of, labor or even induction, just like you talked about, right? So for inductions, we have like what we call the Bishop score, where we look at the consistency, the softness, the position of the cervix. And we spend a
Mhm.
lot of time on cervical ripening. And often it feels like nothing is happening. Nothing is happening for
Yeah.
like 24 hours. We're doing all this, right? The
Yeah.
misoprostol, the mechanical ripeners, like the balloons that are
Hmm.
stretching and releasing prostaglandins. But, it feels like nothing's happening because those contractions haven't really picked up. The
Yeah.
feeling is some cramps, some mild contractions, but that remodeling needs to happen, whether it
Yeah.
happens over the course, which is, of course, preferable of pregnancy. And then once that cervix is ready, I talk about, cervical dilation as if you have like those pink erasers in school, and if you try to stretch it open, it's practically impossible, even a tiny
Yeah.
eraser. But if I take a cotton ball and I just stretch, right, easy to open. And
Easy.
that's how I see the cervix. Once it
Yeah.
remodels, once it becomes soft and ready to dilate, oxytocin can work. The cervix just is able to stretch much more easier and dilate much more easier. And so then it's we're not, just sort of pounding that thick eraser.
Hmm.
So definitely important to support our body, because
Yeah.
that's the door, right? That's the door that's
Absolutely.
going to let baby out. And so that it's so important. And we talk about, a lot of women want to know, how do I ripen the cervix naturally? How do I help my cervix ripen? How do
Yeah.
I get my body ready? Before we talk about sort of exogenous things like that people can take, what are the things that are important in nutrition to
Yeah.
support the body? And then we'll talk about things that
Yeah.
that additional things, I should say.
Well, and there's a lot of things that happen nutritionally. And of course, this remodeling of the fibers is just even the first step within the cervical ripening step process. And as we move through third trimester, again, as these hormones, it's like a stair step, right? You can't go from here to here. You can't jump the stairs. You have to go through each one of these steps. And the first step is the unwinding of these fibers by cortisol. Now, the next step is we want to give them some flexibility, right? They've got to be able to stretch and move. And that's where other hormones come in. So as we move through third trimester, the other adrenal hormone that we kind of talked about earlier was that DHEA. And what DHEA is going to do basically is the placenta is going to take DHEA and it's going to convert that into estrogen. And we could go into probably way more detail on the different types of estrogen. There's E1, E2, E3, and E4, right? E4 is only found in pregnancy. So there's like this whole world of different estrogens. So when I say estrogen, it's going to be the cumulatory estrogens here. And estrogen is going to be responsible for the production of things like our prostaglandins. Now, prostaglandins are the base of things like our cervical ripening medication that we use in medical inductions. And what prostaglandins do is they give these fibers that flexibility, right? So cool. The other thing estrogen is going to do is it's going to start producing small amounts of oxytocin on the inside of the uterus. The placenta, the amniotic sac, all the uteroplacental units actually make their own oxytocin. And on the inside of the uterus, we're going to start to see oxytocin levels increase. What oxytocin is going to do is it's going to increase the prostaglandin receptors on the cervix, meaning we now have a place for those prostaglandins to do their job. And the more prostaglandins that get produced, the more oxytocin gets produced. So it's this wonderful little cyclical thing between estrogen levels increasing and oxytocin in the uterus increasing and prostaglandin levels increasing. And what that's going to do, again, as we're unwinding these fibers, we're giving them that flexibility. So as we get to the next phase of cervical ripening, the cervical fibers are ready to accept that next phase. And again, this is happening in those stair steps as we move through the third trimester. As we get towards the end of pregnancy, if we want to just stay talking about the cervical ripening component, is eventually the levels of prostaglandins hits a threshold. And they hit this threshold and we kind of domino into that next phase. And the next phase is the production of a compound called hyaluronic acid. Most people who've heard of hyaluronic acid have heard of that as a skincare, right? We use it for our wrinkles as we get older. We don't want those little neck wrinkles. We put a little hyaluronic acid on there. Part of why, as we get older, we actually get more thinner skin or we get stiffer skin is because we lose some of that hyaluronic acid, because estrogen is a big pusher of hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is a lubricant of skin and cartilage. And what it's going to do is it's going to come in and it holds fluid in suspended animation kind of in between fibers and in between cells. So we've unwound the fibers. We've given them some flexibility, and now we're going to fill the gaps with hyaluronic acid. And this is now that cervical effacement component. This we can feel and we can see. This is what you guys are looking for when you do a cervical check, right? You're like, oh, you're 30% effaced. You're 80% effaced. Oh my God, we're 100% effaced. That's the surge of this hyaluronic acid into the cervix that gives it its squishy factor. We've put so much fluid in there that now it's jello. There are a handful of studies out there that talk about, and I know that there have been some researchers toying with the use of hyaluronic acid for inductions. And according to these studies, it's actually more effective than using Pitocin and the cervical ripening agents with less side effects. But the method in which they have been doing it is injecting hyaluronic acid into the cervix. I think it was like every 3 hours. Nobody wants to be injected in the cervix, especially when they're in labor. That sounds horrible. So they deemed it kind of like an unuseful method. But what those studies taught us was the importance of hyaluronic acid in this last phase of cervical ripening as we prepare for actual active labor, or we are actually in active labor. And so hyaluronic acid, you'll start to see some of that surging into the cervix, as early as that late third trimester, 36 weeks, something like that would be a pretty normal time frame in order to actually start to see some of that squishy factor happening in that cervix. We don't want that too soon, right? We also don't want it too late. But there is a huge surge right at the start of active labor, which is really cool. And I've seen a couple of studies where they're testing maternal blood levels of compounds like hyaluronic acid, and they can almost see this huge surge right before the onset of active labor. And they talk about using it as like a predictor of the onset of active labor and some of those things. So it becomes this really, really important compound for that cervical effacement, cervical ripening side of things. And it's interesting because hyaluronic acid is a carbohydrate-based compound. So it's made from our carbohydrates, right? So we need our prostaglandins, we need our estrogen, we need carbohydrates, and we need 2 important minerals, magnesium and manganese. Nobody talks about poor little manganese. He's like a forgotten nutrient, I feel like. And it's really interesting because if you look at foods that have a lot of these things in it, it makes actually really good sense why things like dates are shown to help improve labor outcomes, right? Big old ball of carbohydrates. There's some minerals in there. It's kind of got like a little, it's like a little, hyaluronic acid helper in a way. But you can also benefit from things like sweet potatoes, white potatoes, bananas, even going straight to things like, again, chicken skins. Skin and cartilage in and of itself has some hyaluronic acid in it. So that's just the cervix side of things.
I want to talk a little bit about relationships and stress and how stress plays a role in labor. Um, how do stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline interfere with potentially labor, and oxytocin, and is there an interaction there? I
Yeah.
definitely see an interaction
Yeah.
in early labor versus later labor, more
Yeah.
active labor, and those they come up differently. So I wanted to see what your thoughts are on that.
hmm There have been some really cool studies that talk about melatonin in active labor, which I think are probably fitting into this, where there's this element of most women are going to start labor at night, right? When we feel safe, secure. It's kind of like in this like innate biology of ours to want to birth at night, kind of like animals. Animals birth at night most of the time. And so there's a melatonin component to labor and delivery that's just starting to be researched. But we do see that there is this interesting connection between melatonin and oxytocin. And so there's an element of that safety component. So if melatonin is higher, ooh, we can produce some more of that oxytocin. And then if melatonin is not as high or we don't feel as safe, cortisol is elevated, we don't make as much of that oxytocin. The body wants to feel safe. And, as somebody like yourself who's doing some hospital births, I'm sure you see that too. People could be, and when I used to attend births, I would have clients who were in beautiful active labor, and then we come in and we start talking to them and we pull them out of their meditative state, and then labor slows down, right? We're turning on a part of the brain that puts them a little bit more into fight. We have to engage. I'm not as meditative. There's really cool studies that talk about the neurotransmitter perspectives of active labor and how that plays into oxytocin production, from melatonin to even the production of DMT in active labor. And for those of you who don't know what DMT is a dimethyltryptophan, which is basically a hallucinogenic. It's what's found in like ayahuasca, right? A South American hallucinogenic drug. In labor, women produce high amounts of DMT when they're going through natural birth, particularly as they're in active labor going through transition. It's when melatonin is actually the highest as well. And it becomes this almost meditative dream state. And if you've seen women who've hit this in active labor, and I've been at births where like, oh, they're so tired, they're falling asleep during, in between contractions. Yeah, that's happening. And it's happening because these hormones are kicking in, or these neurotransmitters are kicking in to get her through that, right? It's a natural neurotransmitter surge to help her not really remember what's going on, right? It's a meditative transient state. I had both of my kiddos unmedicated, and I tell you what, you feel it, right? You get out of it, you're like, God, I remember labor, but I kind of don't remember it at the same time. Weird, right?
It's
And
an interesting sensation, yeah,
it's
for
an
sure.
interesting sensation. And part of what helps that surge in those specific neurotransmitters is that feeling of safety. If we start to feel stressed, we're going to get, and we do get a huge catecholamine surge. This does happen. It's like I can't ever, it's either a 50% increase in norepinephrine and a 500% increase in adrenaline, or vice versa. I get them mixed up all the time. But there's this catecholamine surge that happens at transition. And you have the catecholamines and you have all of these wonderful other neurotransmitters. What tends to happen is if we get out of our meditative state, we feel this so much more, right? We have to have both of them to balance it out. And if we feel this, oh man, now we're stressed. Now we're going to bump up that
No.
cortisol more, and that makes labor less effective. Sometimes it'll even stall labor, and we see that the more stressed somebody is, the more stalled their labor can be.
Exactly. Um, Partners play a role, doulas play a role. Do you
Hmm.
want to talk a little bit about that and
Yeah.
helping women decrease that stress and feel safe for birth?
Yeah, absolutely. The support system somebody has does make a big difference. And we do see studies that show that having a good support system, having a doula improves birth outcomes. And, it's like as somebody who, as a doula, right, would go to births, I hate to say you're not doing much because I used to say like my job as a doula, I'm a lazy doula and I don't want to work that hard at birth. I want to enjoy that birth. Like I want to be there. I'm like, oh my God, look at the baby. So I do a lot of pre-leg work. That's why I got into, I think exploring a lot of this stuff from my perspective is I worked with clients through fertility journeys. Then we went into pregnancy and they're like, oh man, I really want you there for the end, the grand finale. I was like, all right, let's do this. I kind of want to do the doula side too. Let's go to some of these births. And having clients have good functional birth experiences makes everybody in the room enjoy it, right? As a doula, our job is to be the support system, the guide, the person who helps them through those different stages of labor and maintains the peace. We create a safe space. And I think that's the beauty of doulas is the support system is creating that safe space so that a mother can go through the natural rhythms of childbirth and not have to go into her more active mind space. She can go into the meditative mind state knowing that she's got people behind her, she's got people playing the middleman, and she doesn't have to engage with anybody. She can really go in and just ignore the rest of the world. And I think that's that beauty,
100%.
right? If we're having to engage mom over and over and over again, and unfortunately she's having to make some decisions because it's her body, right? But if we're constantly putting everything on her, it pulls her out of that mindset and it changes her neurochemistry and it changes her birth experience. We also find, and I'll see this more so in moms earlier in pregnancy, where there might be changes. Maybe it's early cervical ripening or preterm labor or other things where she's not in a good relationship, right? And there's a lot of stress happening in there. We do know that marital stress, and I'm not saying like normal marital stress, right? We all have arguments with our spouses or our partners, but like abusive situations is associated with worse birth and pregnancy outcomes because mom is stressed. And if we're stressed and our body is stressed, depending on what phase of pregnancy we're in, that can trigger either early expulsion of our baby. Well, we're stressed. It's not a good time to have a baby if we're stressed. Or it turns into, well, we're stressed. We can't have a baby, right? Other way around. And we kind of hold that baby in a little longer. So we know, and we'll see studies that talk about the effects of emotional situational stress on birth outcomes, including things like preeclampsia risk, which is kind of interesting. So outside of even birth, we'll see that stress component playing a big game. And I think we don't talk enough about stress, whether it's emotional stress or physical stress, and how that affects our birth outcomes. But it is something we do see in research.
Absolutely. Well, our body really can't differentiate between emotional stress and physical stress,
Mm-hmm.
and it sort of counts um, both as threatening,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's physical or emotional. Um, I do see just in practice worse outcomes when women are under a great amount of stress. Whether that's I've seen work play a big role,
Mm-hmm.
more in the recent couple years with a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and it's definitely it plays a role. We know there are many studies that show that stress plays a role. And again, inordinate stress, not like daily stress that we all, but like big stressful events definitely play a role. So um, lots of things that we can do to support women through this process. Doulas are amazing. Having a supportive partner to maintain the peace, to be potentially the voice. The discussion has been had about what the woman wants, and then the doula can ask for those things, and then be the filter maybe between the provider and the woman, and sort of navigate, help the birthing woman navigate the process of, questions, decision making, where she doesn't have to come out of her the work of labor itself. It's, I mean, when you're in labor, when I was in labor, I definitely didn't want to make any decisions. I mean, maybe I could have said like yes or no, like squatting or standing, but that's about it. The intensity of labor is intense enough where other decisions just cannot be made
Yes.
at that point. We talked a little bit about nutrition. I wanted to hit on just a couple more things in terms of foods or supplements in how to support a woman's body in getting ready for labor. So not
Mhm.
necessarily just the cervix, but just her body overall. Um, do omega-3 fatty acids play a role? And everybody's taking a prenatal vitamin these days,
Yeah.
but what else should we be taking besides that prenatal vitamin? What other things? We mentioned the minerals and the foods
Yeah.
that we can be eating, we should be eating. Is there anything that we missed?
I think it depends on person to person. I'm a huge proponent of eating our nutrition versus supplementing our nutrition. I truly believe you cannot supplement out of a bad diet and a bad lifestyle habit. So, that being said, right, I think that there are, I mean, not all prenatals are even created equally. So, there's a lot of gaps that happen in supplementation. I think that when I'm like talking about this labor and delivery side, because we have so much time to work on it, if I can get somebody to incorporate these foods that really do support the natural physiology, that's way better than taking a supplement. When it comes to supplements, I think we also run the risk of overdosing on supplements. And I will say in clinic, if I'm treating clients on a weekly basis, I'd say 75% of the people I'm seeing are overdosing on their supplements. And we're actually pulling things back now versus putting more things in. And it's kind of like a reverse. So it used to be like everybody's deficient and they've all got to take these things. Now I'm seeing definitely people who are taking too much of certain nutrients. I think that the EPA, DHA, the fish oil game has been an interesting one over the years because DHEA is great. It's awesome. We love DHEA for brain development and all those things. DHA doesn't do anything without its friend EPA. And I'm definitely seeing people supplementing with EPA and DHEA combos more regularly now. Worst case, we'll just read. So when it comes to like the EPA, DHA fish oil supplements, doing a supplement that is a combo is more effective for what we're actually trying to do.
We've covered so much, the different parts of the body, the mom, the baby, placenta, the cervix, and the uterus, and how all of that interconnects to really allow for labor to happen. For somebody listening, going through everything that we talked about, what are your 3 to 5 simple steps or things for supporting a functional childbirth? If you had to pick a couple, what would you tell a woman um, to do?
So the first one I think would be the don't be afraid of carbohydrates. I think in modern nutrition now we have a war on carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are very important in pregnancy. And I think that's something I talk about a lot. And when I say carbs, people are like, well, I don't want to eat donuts and I don't want to eat cereal. I'm like, well, don't eat donuts and cereal. That's not what I'm saying. But I don't think there's anything wrong with whole grains. I don't think there's anything wrong with sweet potatoes and bananas and fruit. These are all great sources of carbohydrates. And we need these. We need starchy carbohydrates for hyaluronic acid production. Sweet potatoes, bananas, dates, right? These sorts of things. You need to have an element of a carb base, a reserve as you go into labor to have the energy to burn at a cellular level to get you through that process. And I think that carbohydrates have a place in specifically the maternal diet, regardless of gestational diabetes and those sorts of things. We still need carbs. A lot of our carb sources also come with minerals. So again, we don't want simple carbs. That's not what we're saying here. Don't be picking up candy and Twix and Snickers bars. We're thinking complex carbohydrates that are nutrient dense. And again, I'm not anti-grain. I think grains have a place in the diet. We've eaten grains for a very long time. We know Neanderthals fermented barley, wild barley, and ate it. We can see it on the plaque of their teeth. These grains have a lot of these nutrients that we're talking about. Manganese, this mineral nobody ever talks about, found very high in grains. So I think that those have a wonderful place. And I think that's something that helps in preparation for labor and delivery. The other thing would be eat your meat whole, right? We want joint capsules. We want bone in,
Mm.
skin on chicken, not boneless, skinless chicken breast. So if you're going to eat meats, make sure you eat it in its whole form. If you're cooking salmon, cook it with the skin on. That gray layer between the skin and the meat is full of vitamin A and vitamin D and a lot of these great nutrients. Let's see, what would be some of the other things? Get enough sleep. I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, and especially in pregnancy, because I know pregnancy insomnia is absolutely a thing. And I always joke it's kind of, preparing you for postpartum when your baby's keeping you up all the time. It doesn't feel very good when you're in it. But try to get enough sleep. You want to rest. You want to have a good energy reserve, especially if you are close to labor and delivery. This is not the time to go on big excursions. This is not the time to do those big long runs or do heavy workouts. You need to not train to the bitter end. You have to go through a little bit of a reserve, right? You have to recover a little bit so that you have the energy to get through the labor experience, because we don't know what your labor experience is going to be. Is it going to be quick and to the point? Are you going to be at it for a little while? We also find, again, from an inflammatory perspective, sleep is how we detox. And sleep is very important for the prevention of inflammation buildup as we get close to the end of pregnancy. Everything about labor and delivery is inflammation based. Part of what triggers the onset of labor is inflammatory cytokines that are produced by the baby's lungs. So there is this buildup of inflammation that does happen in the body. And it's when we sleep that we can detox this and keep it from hitting some of these toxic levels that may turn into something like late onset preeclampsia or late onset hypertension or postpartum preeclampsia. So again, bigger than just birth outcomes, it's that long-term game. I have a handout on my website that is my functional childbirth handout. And from a dietary perspective, I have a list on the back that's like my top foods to eat in preparation for labor and delivery. So if people want more insight on like the nutrition component of like, here's the top foods that I think actually benefit women in that preparation for labor, there is that handout. Some of the things we talk about on there are like a lot of fresh herbs or those vitamin leafy greens, those sorts of things that are going to be high in that vitamin K. That's going to help with labor and delivery, obviously blood clotting factors, and nuts and seeds, legumes. There's a whole list of things on the back of there.
And I can link that in the description so that folks
Mm-hmm.
can grab it easily.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
And for somebody who's at the end of their pregnancy and maybe feeling like, well, I'm late to the game, I have a week, 2 weeks left, what encouragement would you leave them with?
You got this. It's okay, right? It's never be okay. It's going to be okay, right? I think there's a lot of panic, especially when I talk to people about these sorts of things. If people are concerned, they can always do some blood tests, like check that thyroid as you're leading up. Oh man, I've got 2 weeks. I guess I could get a quick blood test and check that thyroid and see what those levels are at, right? I would also say to those people too, I have clients all the time who've done everything right, and something still happens, right? It's the control what you can and let go of what you can't control.
Isn't
So
that
it's
labor?
right,
Isn't that all of labor?
exactly. All
You
of
do what
labor.
you can, and
Yes,
then you face it on the minute by minute.
minute by minute.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because there's another person involved in this experience
Yeah,
as well. And that person, their positioning, what they're doing in there, their overall, experience is also going to shape your experience. And as we talk about these like longer first stage labors and all that, sometimes that's a baby position situation where we're just not getting baby down into the pelvis as deep as they should. And no amount of preconception or pre-labor dieting is going to fix that. That is a
absolutely.
uncontrollable. So the idea when I talk about this isn't perfection, because nothing is perfect. It's the idea of controlling what you can and then letting go of what you can't control. And I think, like you said, that sums up labor, right? You're going to go in
Yeah,
with this great mindset, with all these great ideas, and sometimes things don't go the way you think they're going to. And sometimes it's not a bad difference by any means. It's still a good experience. It just didn't go the way you thought. I think my second pregnancy was one of those. I was like, oh, well, this was new. I didn't see that coming.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing that, you have the best intentions in laying plans, but
Absolutely.
labor happens the way it happens. And I think one thing that I would add to this, which is really off topic, but you got me thinking about positioning and baby coming into the pelvis. One thing that I always think about when taking care of women in labor is how that baby's coming into the pelvis. How is the baby rotating? And so, some things that you can do to get ready is maybe do some hip circles on an exercise ball, do some hip stretches. Um, Rest. You're not doing any crazy workouts, but maybe go for a walk. Keep that cardiorespiratory fitness high. We know that women that are active in pregnancy have shorter labors. And so the stretching, the keeping the hips and the ligaments, right? Your body's releasing hormones to really allow your pelvis to shift and move in labor. And so do some things to really help baby then come down and do the rotations and be born. So I know in our hospital we do a lot of things during labor, but really preparation, doing some gentle stretching is also, I think, key in preparing. Sarah,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. You are just a wealth of evidence, a wealth of knowledge, so much good information that you're sharing here today. And I appreciate you being here. If you guys like this episode, I have another episode that I'll link up above where Sarah and I talk about how to support your body to have a healthy pregnancy. So we focus on just the pregnancy. Today we talked about labor preparation, but that's another really great episode that you guys can check out. And I will link it. I'll link Sarah's information and Instagram and the handout that she talked about. And thank you so much, Sarah, for being here and sharing all of this with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.